The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber of the Second World War. It was bigger, faster, flew higher, and carried more bombs than anything that came before it. And yet, despite all this, the B-29 never flew a single combat mission over Europe. Instead, it became infamous in the Pacific, reducing Japanese cities to ashes and delivering the atomic bombs that ended the war. But let's imagine a different history. What if the B-29 had been rushed into service in Europe? What if, instead of facing the cities of Tokyo and Nagasaki, its massive bomb bays had opened above Berlin, Hamburg, and the factories of the Ruhr? Would its advanced technology have crushed the Third Reich from the air? And could the war in Europe have ended years earlier? To answer this, we need to compare the B-29 to the workhorse it was meant to replace, the B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 had already become legendary for its resilience in the skies over Germany. Crews swore by its toughness, telling stories of battered aircraft limping home with entire sections shot away. But the B-29 represented a leap into the future, a bomber designed with pressurized cabins, remote-controlled turrets, and unprecedented range. In this deep dive, we'll explore the strengths and weaknesses of both aircraft, weigh the brutal realities of the air war in Europe, and imagine how history might have changed if the B-29 Superfortress had joined the fight against Nazi Germany, defensive power and survivability. When it came to survival, no bomber's reputation matched the B-17 Flying Fortress. Its nickname wasn't just for show. Armed with up to 1350 caliber machine guns, it relied on sheer volume of fire and tight formations to protect itself from waves of German fighters. Pilots and gunners told stories of B-17s returning with tails shredded, engines dead, and wings full of holes, yet somehow still making it back to England. Nearly 60% of heavily damaged B-17s that limped home were eventually scrapped, a testament to how much punishment they could take before finally giving out. The B-29 took a different approach. Instead of dozens of gunners crouched at every corner, it used a revolutionary system of remote-controlled turrets. On paper, this meant faster, more precise firing. In practice, it was untested, often unreliable, and far less forgiving under the intense, coordinated fighter attacks common in Europe. The B-29's firepower worked best against individual attackers, not swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tearing into bomber streams. But the real danger for the Superfortress wasn't German guns, it was its own engines. The Wright R-3350s that powered the B-29 were temperamental monsters, prone to overheating and catching fire mid-flight. In fact, engine failures and mechanical problems caused more losses in the Pacific than Japanese defenses ever did. If deployed in Europe, those same weaknesses would have been ruthlessly exposed, especially on freezing, high-altitude missions stretching into the heart of Germany. So while the B-17's main weakness was enemy fighters, the B-29's greatest threat might have come from within: altitude, speed, and bombing accuracy. Altitude was one of the B-29's biggest advantages. With its pressurized cabin, crews could operate comfortably at 35,000 feet, well above the B-17's typical ceiling of around 30,000. In theory, this placed the Superfortress above the deadliest belts of German flak and out of reach of many Luftwaffe fighters. The higher you flew, the safer you were. But that safety came at a cost: accuracy. Even in the best conditions, precision bombing during World War II was more hope than science. In 1943, records showed that only about 20% of bombs from a B-17 raid actually landed within the designated target area. Flying even higher, through thinner air and stronger winds, the B-29 would have faced the same, if not worse, problems. In other words, the Superfortress could drop more bombs and do so from a safer altitude, but actually hitting specific targets would remain a major challenge. Speed, however, was firmly in the B-29's favor. With a maximum speed of 357 miles per hour, it was nearly 70 miles per hour faster than the B-17. That extra speed could shave precious minutes off a bombing run, giving German interceptors less time to climb, organize, and attack. In the brutal cat-and-mouse game of European air combat, even small differences in speed often meant the difference between life and death. So, the B-29 offered better protection through altitude and speed, but its bombing accuracy would likely have suffered. That raised a bigger question. Was the trade-off worth it when precision strikes against factories and oil plants were essential to breaking Germany's war machine? Payload, range, and potential impact. Where the B-29 truly outclassed the B-17 was in sheer offensive power. The Flying Fortress could haul about 4,500 pounds of bombs on a long-range mission into Germany. Respectable, but limited. The B-29, by contrast, could carry up to 10,000 pounds, more than double the load. On shorter missions, it could even haul an astonishing 20,000 pounds, making a single Superfortress the equivalent of several B-17s. Then there was range. The B-17 had a combat radius of around 2,000 miles, just enough to reach Berlin from England and limp home with the help of long-range escorts. The WWII could fly nearly 3,700 miles, giving it the ability to strike any German target with ease. This extra reach meant that deep industrial centers in southern Germany, Czechoslovakia, or even Austria could have been hit with less risk of running out of fuel. To put this into perspective, let's revisit the infamous Schweinfurt raid of October 14, 1943, Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s against German ball-bearing plants. Only 229 made it to the target, dropping about 42 tons of bombs and crippling production by 38%. Now, imagine if those bombers had been B-29s. With their heavier payloads, they could have dropped well over 120 tons, potentially slashing production by 60, 70, or even 80%. The difference is staggering. On paper, the B-29 could have delivered hammer blows to Germany's industrial base, the kind that might have shortened the war, but paper advantages rarely survive the brutal test of combat. And in Europe, the Superfortress would have faced problems the Pacific Theater never exposed fully: reliability issues and projected losses. For all its cutting-edge features, the B-29 came with a hidden enemy: its own engines. The Wright R-3350s were powerful but notoriously unstable. Overheating was common, and in many cases, it led to catastrophic engine fires that spread rapidly through the aircraft. In fact, during its early service in the Pacific, more B-29s were lost to mechanical failure than to enemy action. Out of 414 recorded losses, 267 were due to engines or other system malfunctions, while only 147 were caused by Japanese defenses. Now, place that same bomber in Europe, where missions were longer, colder, and where German fighters attacked in coordinated swarms. The stress on the engines would have been relentless. Analysts estimate that if a force of 300 B-29s had been dispatched on a raid like Schweinfurt, as many might never have reached the target, not because of German firepower, but because of breakdowns, fuel leaks, or engine explosions. And those that did survive the mechanical gauntlet would have faced the Luftwaffe. Unlike Japanese defenses, which were already crumbling by the time the B-29 entered service, German skies in 1943 were packed with deadly interceptors and flak batteries. Against concentrated fighter attacks, the B-29's remote-controlled turrets might not have been enough. Losses could have equaled, or even surpassed, those suffered by B-17 formations on the worst days of the air war. In short, while the B-29 promised more bombs and longer reach, its early reliability problems could have devastated its effectiveness in Europe. The Superfortress might have looked unstoppable on paper, but in practice, it would have paid a heavy price. Escorts, tactics, and what might have changed. The brutal lesson of the European air war was clear. No bomber, no matter how tough, could survive Germany's defenses without fighter escort. The B-17 proved this on Black Thursday, when 77 aircraft were lost in a single mission. The B-29, despite its higher speed and altitude, would have faced the same reality. Remote turrets and heavier bomb loads could not make up for the lack of cover when hundreds of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swarmed in. But by late 1943 and into 1944, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang began to change everything. With drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Had the B-29 entered Europe at this point, its combination of higher speed, longer range, and massive payloads could have been devastating when paired with Mustang protection. Entire sectors of German industry might have been obliterated in weeks rather than months. Tactically, the B-29 also opened doors the B-17 never could. With its ability to strike deeper targets, raids could have hit not just German factories, but also vital oil fields in Eastern Europe with greater efficiency. The Luftwaffe, already strained by fuel shortages in 1944, might have collapsed even faster under this pressure. So, while the B-29 on its own could not have revolutionized the air war, its full potential was tied directly to escorts and timing. With Mustangs overhead and its payload unleashed, the Superfortress might have turned the tide of the bombing campaign months earlier than it did historically. Could the B-29 have ended the war in Europe sooner? So, let's return to the big question. If the B-29 had been deployed over Europe, could it have ended the war sooner? The answer is complicated. On one hand, the Superfortress was a bomber ahead of its time. It flew higher, faster, and farther than the B-17. It could deliver double the bomb load, reaching deep into enemy territory and striking with a scale of destruction the Germans had never faced. In combination with long-range P-51 escorts, this might have accelerated the collapse of German industry, especially once oil plants and transportation hubs became prime targets. A concentrated B-29 campaign in 1944 could have choked the Reich's war machine even faster than history records. But technology doesn't win wars on its own. In 1943, when the Allies most desperately needed an edge, the B-29 was plagued with catastrophic mechanical problems. Engines caught fire, systems failed, and dozens of planes were lost before they even reached enemy skies. In Europe's harsher environment, those problems would have been magnified. Instead of saving lives, early deployment of the B-29 could have cost even more crews than the B-17 already did. The reality is that the B-29's true stage was the Pacific, where its range and payload could be used without the same intensity of enemy resistance. In Europe, it might have been too early, too fragile, and too unreliable to live up to its potential. So, could it have ended the war sooner? Perhaps. But more likely, the B-29 would have suffered heavily in 1943, only proving decisive once its flaws were solved. And by then, Germany's fate was already sealed. Closing narration. In the end, the story of the B-29 Superfortress is one of timing. It was a machine designed for the future, arriving just a little too late to change the war in Europe. The B-17 Flying Fortress had already carried the weight of the air campaign across the skies of Germany, proving its worth in fire and steel. The B-29, meanwhile, stepped into a different theater, one where its range and payload could finally shine without the same relentless opposition. Had it been sent to Europe in 1943, the B-29 might have rewritten history, or it might have collapsed under the brutal reality of its own flaws. That what if remains one of the most fascinating questions of the Second World War. What we do know is that by the time the Superfortress finally showed its strength, it brought about a new and terrifying era of warfare, one that ended with mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The B-29 never flew above Berlin, never dropped bombs over the Ruhr, and never replaced the B-17 in the skies of Europe. But its shadow still looms large. a reminder of how a single aircraft can shape the course of history, if only the moment is right.